Is this set to go?
You're good to go.
Well, good afternoon, community members. We've made a new record today. We're only 16 minutes late. I apologize. Today we're going to talk about the presidency of McKinley, who was our 25th president. And today is also the third day of a major celebration in India. It's called Diwali. It's the Festival of Lights. It's been going on for 3 days and will go on for 2 more. And in one of the villages in India, they are celebrating, because of course that's the village from which the ancestors of Kamala Harris came, and another village way across the other side of the globe where the Irish relatives of Biden came from, they're celebrating. So I want to wish you a happy Diwali, a festival of lights that goes on for 5 days on the Indian subcontinent. But McKinley did not come from India or from Ireland. He came from Ohio. He's one of those long line of Ohio presidents. He's also the last president of the United States to ever have served in the American Civil War. And amazingly, he started out as a private, an enlisted man at the bottom of the ranks, and worked his way up finally to that of an officer by the time of Antietam and Gettysburg. So that's the goodbye sign for the American heritage coming out of the Civil War. He was the favorite of many African Americans to be president. Not that many of them got a chance to vote. He visited the South. He actually visited Tuskegee with his wife and met the great man there, Booker T. Washington. But he's not noted for any advancement in civil rights. It's just something that he did on his way to look at the United States. He is most famous and in many ways notorious for the movement of the United States away from being the people we were to being an imperial colonial people. And this comes with the big mistake of the war with Spain. Now, it took decades to learn the facts of the war with Spain. And the man who gave us the facts was the father of the American nuclear navy, Admiral Rickover, who led an investigation into the sinking, so-called sinking of the battleship Maine in the harbor at Havana. Havana is a very unusual and very protected harbor. It's a long, narrow area in which you have to go through to get in. It's along the wonderful Malecon. And the Maine certainly did sink. The problem was Rickover found out what was suspected at the time. The Maine was new, but an old construction. And the Maine was using bituminous coal. And bituminous coal sends up a lot of coal dust. And when in a compacted area, it often explodes. And in fact, the Maine was sunk by its own coal supply. And you can tell that because we found the Maine. And the implosion came outward, that is, from inside the ship out. And if the Spanish were to put a mine next to it, the implosion would have gone inside. And certainly Rickover would know that better than anybody, since he designed all the nuclear aircraft carriers and particularly the nuclear submarines in our current Navy. So it was, we had a bogus reason for this war. But what to do about that? Well, at the time, there wasn't much you could do because we had, working in this country, real fake news. I know that the fake man in the White House now thinks that he invented the term, but in fact, it was called yellow journalism years ago, and it was practiced by 2 awful publishers of big newspaper chains, One was William Randolph Hearst, and the big newspaper chain out here in California, of course, was the Chronicle. But he owned other newspapers as well. And the other man was Pulitzer out of St. Louis. And the Pulitzer newspapers are also very influential, and their name lives on in the wonderful Pulitzer Prize that many people would like to get. So there you are, two people who are willing to stir up the mud and call for war without the evidence. You know, at the New York Times, they always list all the news that's fit to print. Well, for Hearst and Pulitzer, it was all the news that was unfit to print because it wasn't news. It was made up. It was fake news. And so we marched off to war. And in the process, we became a colonial power. The one thing that we had always opposed was colonialism and imperialism. And now, with what was our ostensible reason to be in Cuba was to support the Cubans in their own fight for independence from Spain. There was a war going on, but it wasn't our war. It wasn't our business. And when we joined in and we were on the winning side, supposedly, we then took possession of Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines, and became a colonial master of people who didn't want us. It's hard for you to believe that when the Filipinos who wanted independence found out that they were just being shifted from one power to the other, they revolted and did not accept our rulership. And they waged a 2-year civil war against us. And leading the occupation of the Philippines was a man who would later become President of the United States, by the name of Taft. But this went down very badly with the Filipinos, and then suddenly badly with the American public, because they discovered they'd taken recalcitrant people, and on top of that, God forbid, they were Roman Catholics. And yet there we were, owning a colonial empire that we'd ripped off from the Spanish. And this caused a major revolution at home in Spain. And the revolutionaries who came to power in Spain led Spain into the 20th century and were some of the most brilliant men Spain had birthed since its golden age under Philip II. So it was not a good sign, and it was McKinley's error. Now, McKinley had made some very good, he was very popular. He put up a very high tariff. And in putting that tariff up and the way it was held and the gerrymandering that went on in the elections at the end of the 1890s, a Democrat snuck into office. That's when you get Grover Cleveland. But that's only for 2 terms. Then we're back to Ohio and Republicans. They were still waving the bloody shirt of the Civil War. Now, Mr. Republican in those days was Mark Hanna from Ohio, who ran the Republican Party. And it turned out that the vice president under the first term that McKinley served had died in office. And so now it was a time to find a new vice president. And there was a very, very ambitious guy who had actually been in the war with Spain. He had organized his own little group of guys, and they had gone off, and they were called the Rough Riders, and they had charged up San Juan Hill. Now, I've told you several times I have been to Cuba. It's a wonderful place to go. Cuban people are wonderful. They don't need our help at all. And I want to tell you, I took my group to San Juan Hill, which is on the other side, the eastern side of the island, facing towards Haiti and the French island. And so it was that when we got there, I asked the Cuban, where was San Juan Hill? And he pointed to me. San Juan Hill is around twice my height. In other words, you can walk up it in around 3 minutes. So the so-called Rough Rider group up San Juan Hill was a nothing. You could do it in a minute, backwards, with your 1 foot tied. So much for Teddy Roosevelt and the charge up San Juan Hill. And so it was when the war was over, we were stuck with these ex-Spanish colonies, speaking Spanish and also Roman Catholic, and also not wanting us. And we took in the bargain also Guam. And then later, the McKinley people decided, well, it was time to take Hawaii, which was an independent kingdom by then, and we did. The takeover of Hawaii is beautifully told in a book by James Michener, which was then made into a very big, splashy Hollywood film called Hawaii. And Michener's book tells the story through the arrival in Hawaii of missionaries. Now, without your having to guess, the last thing the Hawaiians felt they needed was a bunch of missionaries coming over from the United States to teach them about God. Nevertheless, this was what they inherited from us. Later, they're, of course, to become a state and then contribute mightily to our country. They also are to become a major interest of some people in San Francisco. There was a sugar baron in San Francisco who was anxious to get more and more sugar land. And he found that land, of course, in Hawaii. And the woman he married used those sugar millions to build something in San Francisco that most of you know. It's called the Legion of Honor. It is a major museum, attracts thousands of people, has a wonderful series of shows. Right now, the big show for those series of museums is located in the DeYoung Museum, which is not far from the Legion. The Legion is beautifully located looking over the Pacific, and the DeYoung is located in the middle of Golden Gate Park. At Golden Gate Park today, we have a wonderful show exhibit of a great Mexican artist, Kahlo, and her work. And she and her boyfriend, Diego Rivera, spent time in San Francisco. So we have connections to those people. And even UC Berkeley has an original painting that was given to the university that has been hanging in a very famous house on the San Francisco side of the bay. And the woman who owned that house, she was a Haas, she dedicated the mural to the women's dorm at Berkeley, where unfortunately it's still located. We had a very hard time finding it. It should be moved immediately into the art museum at Berkeley since we have a brand new one. Anyway, this takes us too far away from McKinley. As you know, McKinley's name was given to the tallest mountain in North America, Mount McKinley. But the people in Alaska didn't like that. And when Alaska became a state, having been bought by that Secretary of State for Lincoln, they're now a state, and they asked to change the name. Well, the people in Ohio were furious, and the delegation from Ohio made sure that in Congress the name did not get changed. What did they want to change it to? They wanted to change it to Diwali. And Diwali, of course, is a name that's ethnic to Alaskan history. And the fight was on, and only finally, in the time of President Barack Obama, going all the way up to Obama, all the way back to McKinley, the name of Mount McKinley is now, according to President Obama, Mount Denali, excuse me. So these things trace themselves back and forth, but the problems were horrendous, and they didn't get better. Now, we have with us some people who are Polish Americans, so I won't want to offend them, but There was a Polish American who came to the United States in McKinley's time, and he'd also gone to a very famous series of lectures by a woman that many people thought was a communist. And so he imbibed in this vision of the future, and he thought to help us along the way, he would assassinate McKinley. And so he began to track him. He went to one speech, but he couldn't get close enough. So he came back to a speech that McKinley was going to give in Buffalo. And this time he got close enough. He pulled out his pistol, and at very short range, he fired twice, 2 bullets into McKinley's stomach. McKinley was rushed to a hospital. Doctors were called. Medicine was rather minimum in those days. They got 1 bullet out. So for some reason, they couldn't find the other, even though they had a rudimentary x-rays. And so they left it in. Well, that's not good. And his wound turned septic, and he slowly died, a very, very painful death of gangrene of the stomach lining. The shooter, the Polish American who assassinated the president, had been captured. He was tried and sent to the electric chair. Our terrible desire to get vengeance by killing one who'd killed another. Then there was a long parade of bringing the body down to the nation's capital, putting it in the White House, then taking it to the Capitol itself to lie in state under the Capitol dome, then to take it all the way back to Ohio, to put it there for Ohioans to see. And 100,000 people in both Washington and in Ohio came to see the president and say farewell. And in the case of Washington, it was on a very rainy, stormy day. And so he was gone. Now, in the process, of course, that meant that Teddy Roosevelt was going to be president of the United States. And the Republican leadership was very unhappy with this because they didn't want him to begin with. It was because he was popular, because he had ridden up that hill in Cuba, because he had led the Rough Riders, who were nobodies going nowhere, no time. But he had scored, he was very popular, and he became president of the United States, and he led many of these memorials and also helped build the wonderful memorial that's still in Buffalo, New York, to honor the place where McKinley was shot. Now, all of that is one story. The other story that's interesting is how this fake news led us into a terrible war that just simply upheaved the part of the Spanish Empire that remained, that we took over unwanted, where then the governor of the Philippines, which was later President Taft, had to put down a 2-year rebellion of Filipinos who didn't want us. You can imagine not wanting the Americans. Amazing. And so now we come to, how did this happen? Well, these 2 mega publishers with many, many newspapers, not just the St. Louis Dispatch or the San Francisco Chronicle. Hearst actually had a New York newspaper. And they decided on their own that we should go to war. To hell with the vax. So little was done to look into the issue, and we went off to war. So who is this William Randolph Hearst, since he's so close to us? Well, he was very wealthy. In fact, he'd gone all over Europe collecting things, not little dishes or plates or some porcelain or some silver, but whole chapels from Spanish monasteries, whole areas of ballrooms from French chateaus, whole slices of castles from the Rhineland of Germany. Anything he could get his hands on, big bulk, and had them all shipped back to California. And then he wanted them all turned magically into a Xanadu type of palace made up of all these separate, distinct things. And he came to Berkeley and he found an incredibly talented woman who had studied at Paris at the Beaux-Arts. And she and two men were the creators of the California style. The leader of the pack was actually Maybeck. And you can see the glory of Maybeck. You go to the Berkeley campus and go to the men's faculty club. He built it, everything in it. It's solid redwood. The floors are redwood, the walls are redwood, the ceilings are redwood, the pilings are, everything is redwood. And it's glorious. It's his statement. And it remains there on the campus today. You can go there for lunch if they will let you in with the COVID problem. That was Maybeck. Her name was Julia Morgan. Her great thing on the campus, of course, is the Hearst School of Mining. It's a beautiful building. She also built for one of the Haas women a gymnasium. It's now the women's gym at Berkeley. And she was the one that Hearst decided could turn all this rubble that he had collected into a Xanadu, a palace unknown, wonderful place. And he could do it not in Los Angeles, not in San Francisco, but down near a little village, San Simeon. And so you get this incredible structure, which is there today, often used as sets for movies. And you have a place where Hearst can hang out with his Hollywood friends. Now, his Hollywood friends ended up being a woman, of course. And this woman starred in a number of MGM films. She wasn't very good. She wasn't very good in films, but she must have been fabulous in bed because he gave up everything for her, his reputation, etc. He had a family here in San Francisco. That family was the one who finally produced Patty Hearst, a famous case of a celeb gone bad on the Berkeley campus. And now he has the woman that he wants to live with and the place he wants to live, San Simeon. He builds a train that comes up from Hollywood so that this Hollywood star and all of her friends, this train was loaded with people like Paulette Goddard, that crazy man who was a little tramp in most of the movies of the silent period, Charlie Chaplin. They all came up to San Simeon for the weekend to party, drink wine, and enjoy the scenery. It's a beautiful part of the country. It's open country. It looks down at the Pacific Ocean so many miles away. Wonderful weather, and has everything that Hearst could want. And since he had a lot of money to spend, he spent it. And so it was that he decided we needed this war without any investigative reporting that we know of in Cuba, no direct Cuban reports. And so he banged the gun of war, the drums of war. And he and Pulitzer were successful in convincing the people around McKinley to go off to war. And so we did, following the lead of two rather inept publishers. Now, someone called me this morning to tell me that McKinley's name lives on right here in California. Apparently there is a stretch in the foothills, apparently, of redwoods, one of those redwood groves. It's named for McKinley here in California. He certainly was popular in his day. He became less popular as time went by because people couldn't look at any achievement. Going to war and beating Spain over a non-issue is not a big achievement. Grabbing Spanish colonies like Puerto Rico, Guam, the Philippines is not an achievement. And so it is that we had to live with the consequences of that because, as you know, while the Philippines tried several times to get free of us, they even had a communist rebellion at the same time, and just before the Vietnamese thing exploded, another disaster for us. The Hucks and the Huckbuckalocks, and they were certainly Marxist, and we had to help in putting their movement down in the Philippines. And then finally the Filipinos said, enough is enough. They're independent today. They told us to go away, to get out of Subic Bay, the Navy base we had in the Philippines, to get out of Clark Air Force Base, the Air Force Base we had in the Philippines. In recent times, they've rented them back to us, but not with any fondness for us. So it turned out that these ventures into colonialism have not been successful. And the Puerto Ricans feel gypped because they've suffered several times with terrible damage done by hurricanes and earthquakes and not received any aid at all. And in fact, Puerto Ricans have been an airborne invasion of New York City. Puerto Ricans decided that San Juan wasn't for them anymore, and so they left San Juan for the island of Manhattan. And they are the genesis for the greatest Broadway play, perhaps of any time, musical play. And that is still been tried. They've tried to resuscitate it recently, but nothing can redo both the Broadway show, which ran for years, and the movie, which ran for a very long time, where the PRs, as they're called in New York, the Puerto Ricans, play as a foist against the other ethnic group, which are going to be Italians, so that you can get this show to move on the road. Now, Broadway shows and regular Broadway shows are not necessarily just like Citizen Kane, the great movie about Hearst, are not factually documentaries. They're made to entertain initially. So the people who live here in Piedmont Gardens are going to get a chance to judge for themselves, because on the 27th and the 28th of this month, we will be showing Citizen Kane, which is a great film by a 25-year-old guy named Orson Welles. And Orson did not do everything. You know, there's been recent claims that other people helped. Of course they helped. He couldn't both act in it and hold the camera at the same time. So he had much help and very creative help in putting together this, what is generally considered greatest film ever made in the United States, Citizen Kane, which of course, word got out very quickly that it was the story of Hearst. And he did everything he could to block it, but in fact, he was not able to. And so the film was made and released and then won many, many awards, Academy Awards and other awards. And is generally thought, given the books that have been written about it, to be one of the great films, if not the greatest film ever made. And that Orson Welles is a genius, and not just a genius at film. Orson Welles got his start in the Broadway scene. He was part of group theater, as it was called. He and the director, Harold Clurman, and a group of actors, and they put on some very left-leaning plays, left-leaning on the politics. And then he caused a sensation. He did a radio show, The War of the Worlds, where we were being invaded by Martians. And people who turned in late were afraid because they thought it was a documentary that was then being made to tell them that an invasion was taking place right as they were listening to the radio. It's hard for you to remember maybe, but radio used to be the dominant form of getting information, certainly ahead of motion pictures. And certainly there is no television. So here we have a world crawling with Martians out to kill you. And you have Wells telling the story as if it's really happening. And after Wells did that, then he came to Hollywood and he did his famous film. Now, he made many other films. I think the best film that he ever made that I liked best was he played Rochester in the great version that he made of Jane Eyre, a wonderful Bronte book. But he also made a wonderful film about a character out of Shakespeare. And the film is called Chimes at Midnight. And it's about that guy who's bothering Prince Hal all the way through those history plays. And it's a big, chubby guy. It was Elizabeth I's favorite Shakespeare character. She kept asking Shakespeare to write another play with Falstaff. Falstaff also became a favorite character of Giuseppe Verdi, who wrote a great opera about Falstaff. So these people then inspired Wells, just in his 20s, to do Chimes at Midnight, which is a beautiful film. And then perhaps my absolute favorite of Wells is where he plays Harry Lime in a wonderful British film about occupied Vienna. And someday we will show that film here also after we've gone through the others. Because the one that many people turn to is because it had the love goddess in it. There was a woman, she was Spanish, daughter of Spanish immigrants, and she danced with her father. And she was dancing in Mexico, and an agent for Harry Cohn at Columbia heard about her and said she was movie material. And Cohen took a look at some of the stills and said, well, we have to fix her. She has to be manufactured. Number one, her hairline has to be raised at least 1.5 inches. So by electrolysis, they were able to lift her hairline. So now she didn't have a round face, which Harry didn't like. She had an oval face. Then she had this very brown, mousy hair. And he said, no, we'll have to check that. We'll turn her into a strawberry blonde, occasionally different shades of blonde, but she's not going to have brown hair. And we don't like the name Rita Casino. It sounds like a Mexican. We'll call her Rita Hayworth. And she became the famous American love goddess. Even the guy who owned Time Life liked what he saw and put her on the cover when she was kneeling on a mattress on a bed in a negligee, and the word love goddess stuck on Rita Hayworth. And so one of the achievements of Wells was to woo and wed Rita Hayworth and to make a film with her, Lady from Shanghai, which is also an intriguing type of murder mystery, which ends up in San Francisco at Playland, where they both draw weapons on each other. They hate each other by now in the film. And they shoot up the place. And of course, if you know anything about Playland, it used to have a kind of hall of mirrors that was round. And you went round and round. So there were at least 14 images of Rita Hayworth and 14 images of Orson Welles. And so you have to keep killing them off until you hit the real person. And so ends Lady from Shanghai. And soon the marriage was over. Wells went on his way, and Hayworth went on to be a superstar at Columbia. She owned the lot. And then she found a Muslim prince in France that she liked better, and she married Ali Khan, and the rest was history. She had one daughter with Wells, Rebecca Wells, and then she went on to have one daughter with Ali Khan, Yasmin Khan, and then she went on to be the superstar that she remained for over 2 decades. But all this happens after Citizen Kane is made into this very influential film, which begins to make people like Rickover and others think that the cause belli for the Spanish War was a fake cause, and that Spain had nothing to do with sinking the battleship Maine. And we knew where the Maine was. We'd brought it up from the bottom. We took it out to sea and sunk it again. But by then, everyone had caught on, and Rickover wrote his report that the Maine was sunk by itself by having this bituminous coal, the coal dust igniting, exploding, and then sinking the ship, and the implosion came from within, not from without. And Rickover knows something about ships, since most of his ships, as far as I know, all of them, nuclear submarines and nuclear carriers, except one that did have a terrible accident. But otherwise, they succeeded being great parts of the US Navy at float today in our various fleets, like the 7th Fleet, the 6th Fleet, the 2nd Fleet, the Atlantic Fleet, and others. So you have this tumultuous time for McKinley. You have his assassination. You have his vice president, the first one having died in office, the second one being Teddy Roosevelt, the man who had helped in the Spanish War against Spain. And now you have the end of McKinley, a terrible death in Buffalo, a long series of memorials for him. He was very popular in his day, but historians today do not think much of his 1.5 administrations. They think his heart was in the right place, but he was not a doer. He did nothing in civil rights. He did show the flag. I mean, he did go to Tuskegee University. He did meet the great man, Booker T. Washington. But African Americans are looking for something more. They were looking for appointments for African Americans. They were looking for a hand up and not a push down. And so it was that he did not have a reputation with them at the end of his term that he'd had at the beginning, when they thought highly of him and that he would do much for them. Because as you know from the time I talked to you last time, Jim Crow is in force, and African Americans are having a very hard time making it in America. So we got through that long nightmare of McKinley. He was the last of the so-called Ohio presidents. We were going to have another one. The Taft that we got, we were going to get another Taft, Robert Taft, who was the senator, who was considered Mr. Republican and was due the nomination, except that the Republicans were so sick of having to look at FDR in the White House for 4 terms, and then followed by Harry Truman, that everyone knew would lose to Dewey, and he didn't, regardless of what the Chicago papers said. So they hadn't seen this inside of the White House in years, so they didn't want to run Taft, who probably would lose, and they lighted on Dwight David Eisenhower. And because Warren was willing to turn the tables on Taft and give the California delegation to Eisenhower, Eisenhower became President of the United States, not Senator Taft, and Mr. Earl Warren, governor, became Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, even though Eisenhower said he had never promised it to him. He'd only promised him an appointment. The problem was it was only the Chief Justice job that was open, and Warren wanted that and didn't want to dig up all the dirt. So rather than cause any fluff to fly, Eisenhower gave in. Warren got the court job he wanted, and Warren went on to lead the Supreme Court in some of its great decisions, particularly in the area of civil rights, which was the key area that needed fixing in this country and still needs fixing in this country. So it is that McKinley lost his mountain in Alaska. There was Barack Obama going up to Alaska saying it's now called something else. It's not called Mount McKinley, it's Mount Dalwali. Like it or like it. And so it was that you get a period in time where America shifts. And one of the things that's happening, of course, in America is growing like topsy. Immigration is speedily filling up this so-called empty country. Immigrants are now coming by the millions. And there is then a movement to block some immigrants, particularly Asians, from first Hawaii, which are going to make a state, and then from California. It's a very ugly story in and of itself. And so we go forward with the presidents that we've looked at. The next time, we're not going to look at presidents. We have two things coming up on the schedule. We're going to look at the Supreme Court, and we're going to have a long, hard look. We're going to look at the court from the time of the first great Supreme Court Justice, John Marshall, to the current Chief Justice, John Roberts. And we're going to look at the issues to reform it, to the many mistakes it made. I give you a couple. Plessy versus Ferguson decided that separate but equal was okay, meaning segregation. No, it wasn't. And the Warren Court changed that, as much as the court does not like to go back and change previous court decisions. Even under the great man FDR, when he, let's go back even further, under Lincoln, when he tried to put an end to habeas corpus, and Chief Justice Taney said, no, you can't do that. And Lincoln, to his great error, said, well, the court has decided, let the court enforce. Then you come to, of course, FDR, so furious that the court doesn't see that the New Deal is a good thing, and particularly after he puts his friend from Harvard on and finds out that Frankfurter doesn't think that the New Deal is so good, that you have the decision, bad decision, to add a lot of people, to stuff the court so that you can get the types of decisions you want. And that blows back on Franklin, and he does not succeed at that. In fact, he causes a midterm election that goes against him over the issue of changing the rules for the court. And now you have Roberts himself writing a very famous article. Roberts now believes that the court should have term limits, like 20. You get appointed for 20 years and then you're out. He thinks that's necessary because he thinks the times do change. As a famous songwriter once said, the times they are changing, and that there's no reason to keep someone who's dying on the court until she actually dies, as in the case of Ginsburg. Or perhaps it's better to have some equal hands so that you don't have the awful decision against the Japanese Americans that was made at the beginning of World War II, when the court had to face Karamatsu versus the United States and decide against Karamatsu, who was only asking for his rights as a citizen. So the court is a very important institution that has had many flaws. Even Ginsburg herself, who everyone admired greatly and now is gone, made a major error when she came publicly out and said that Trump was not worth of serving as president of the United States. Now, I know she believed that and that she was furious about the outcome. But the point was, if you are active as a member of the court, you cannot say things like that in public. Otherwise, you damage the court, which doesn't need any help in damaging. It can damage itself. So we're going to look at the court. Then we're also going to look at three of the most decisive moments in World War II. And these are when our president, who was a crippled man, was willing to go all the way to 3 World War II peace conferences. The first in Tehran, the capital of Iran, where he met with Churchill and Stalin. The second, the most important, the one at Yalta in the Crimea, where he again met with Mr. Stalin, man of steel, and Mr. Churchill. And then the third, which was a real problem, was at Potsdam, the old royal capital of Frederick the Great. And they used the capital there, the palace complex there for their meetings, the palace of Sanssouci, which Frederick has built as his version, small version of Versailles, where he entertained the greats of the French Enlightenment, like Voltaire. Now we would meet there, but this time only one person was still either in office or alive, and that was the man of steel, Stalin, who came in an ironclad railroad car with a battalion of troops guarding it. The others were all new. Harry Truman, that man from Independence, Missouri, and Churchill had been de-elected prime minister. And the British people had decided that they'd already had enough of the conservative government of Churchill. They had suffered through this long war, and they wanted a labor government that would give them healthcare systems and all the things they didn't have, just like us, who never had healthcare until Barack Obama decided we should have it, where every other civilized country had already had it for decades. Leave it to the Anglo-Americans to be late at the table. It should be called a human right. You not only have a right to life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, education, and healthcare. They are human rights, not accidents. And so the British were now going to get it by giving us a new prime minister, and he was going to go to Potsdam. So the only one who knew what had really gone on during the times at Yalta when they sat around, Churchill with his cigar, Stalin with his little pipe, our president with his favorite martini. And they chatted about the world to be, the world to come, and how that world would be shaped by these, the three great powers, later to be joined by France as a fourth great power, how to divide Germany, how to make Germany a peaceful nation again, and then how to win the war against Japan, since suddenly Stalin was interested in joining us in the war against Japan because he had ambitions on that side of Asia. And so it was that two newcomers and one old hand created the world of the future, world we had to live with. And so it's worth going over those conferences in a little bit of detail to get a feeling for them, what they did, how Stalin kept suspiciously looking at Churchill and Franklin Roosevelt and say, when are you going to open a Western front? Apparently you're willing to fight until the last Russian. And so finally, Roosevelt turns to him and says, I will appoint a supreme commander for our second front in Europe, not the one that annoys you, because we'd already landed in Africa. After all, how do you get Ingrid Bergman and Humphrey Bogart at Casablanca, except that the Americans have landed. And it's true, we were there and we were storming across North Africa. We had gotten into Algeria, we were taking Tunisia. We had driven Field Marshal Rommel out of North Africa with his Afrika Korps. But we hadn't, that's not a second front to Stalin. Stalin means take the pressure off of me. I'm losing millions and millions and millions. We now know that the Soviets lost around 36 million people in World War II. We've never, ever come anywhere near that. And I don't think any of our governments would have survived casualty figures that large. And so then the word went out that the Supreme Allied Commander was now living in a very nice palace outside of Naples, a palace that had belonged to the Naples branch of the Bourbon family. It's a small copy of Versailles, very nice place to live. And he's ensconced there, and his army is slowly, and every foot slowly moving up the peninsula that is the Italian boot. We're landing at Salerno. We're going to land at Anzio. We're going to find out we can have Rome. It'll be an open city, no fighting. We're going to create great Italian films out of this. Open City is one of Rossellini's classic masterpieces. Roberto Rossellini, the man who later seduces Ingrid Bergman. And does that ever cause a stir? Even our Congress meets and condemns Joan of Arc, The Bells of St. Mary's, an icon in Hollywood who is now having an affair and a baby out of wedlock with some risky Italian guy. Strange world we have created. But Eisenhower takes over and he goes up the boot and victory finally comes. And then the world is divided as the big three decided it would be divided in their mini conferences, Tehran, Yalta, and then Potsdam. And we will talk about it next time. And I promise to do everything possible to move heaven and earth, to make an end of COVID for you, and to start these damnable programs on time for a change. So again, happy Diwali. It's the Festival of Light in India. It's a wonderful time in India. It's a true big celebration of the Hindu people about themselves and the civilization they have created in the subcontinent. Thank you for your patience and happy Diwali again. Ciao.